So just a heads up to everyone, we're now recording. So.
All right. Keep the swearing to a minimum, Kyle.
Yeah. Welcome back to the 15th Annual Junior Theorist Symposium. And next up is our first keynote address by Kyle Green, who's an assistant professor at the College of Brockport, State University of New York, and Daniel Winchester, who's an associate professor at Purdue University. And they are the winners of the 2019 Junior Theorist Award for talking yourself into it, how and when accounts shape motivation for action. And this was published in Sociological Theory. So after their talk, there's going to be a few minutes for Q&A, and we look forward to that. So thank you all very much.
All right, so to begin, I want to just start with a few thank yous. So thanks for having us. Thanks for watching our talk. We're honored to be awarded this, be given this award by the award committee. I'm not someone who submits my papers for awards, so Dan encouraged me to agree to do this. So especially when you write something that is more theory driven, I have no idea how people respond to it, so it's really exciting to get this response. We're also happy to finally be able to do this. Last year we chose to wait a year with the hope that we would be in person, but we really wanted a chance to actually talk. And so hopefully in the future we will be able to meet you all in person. And then most importantly, we want to thank the organizers. So especially as grad students, this is a big task to take on. And so the organizers this year, Laura and Sarah, and from last year, Jacqueline and Andy, we appreciate the work you've done. So it's really awesome that grad students take this labor on. And then, of course, we're also happy to be in great company with Neil, who's speaking tomorrow. So Dan and I are both fans of Neil's work. So I'll be sure to be there tomorrow to watch that. As in the introduction stated, this talk is based on a paper that is currently in Sociological Theory. It was published in 2019. In this paper, Dan and I draw on our respective ethnographies. So Dan spent about 1.5 years immersing himself in that thing you see on the left of your screen, Eastern Orthodox religion. And I spent almost 6 years training alongside people who were learning mixed martial arts. So learning to strike each other, learning to grapple with each other. So we both drew on this this deep immersion into the practices that we're interested in. Now, as with any project, whether you're a grad student, whether you're a faculty member, there's a lot of luck involved, right? And in this case, Dan and I both chose to attend the University of Minnesota. We didn't have a fully formed idea of what our research projects would actually be, but we both ended up in the right place for the dissertation projects that we ended up doing. So for Dan, he ended up in the Twin Cities of Minnesota and St. Paul, which offered this diverse microcosm of Eastern Orthodox Christian communities and conversions. In other words, there were a lot of Eastern Orthodox churches, and there were a lot of specific religious communities within that larger Eastern Orthodox community. And for myself, I ended up in one of the epicenters of mixed martial arts in the country. So within 20 minutes, I could easily access a variety of types of schools where people would be learning this combat sport and would be spending their lunch hours and after work training with each other. And Twin Cities are not that huge, but I could easily access over 20 schools, which was rare for a metropolitan region of that size. Now, this is just a map of the metropolitan region surrounding the Twin Cities. Dan stuck pretty closely to Minneapolis and St. Paul within the city limits. I drifted a little bit further out in finding my schools. But again, both of us building this ethnographic project. Now, in the, let's see, about 17 minutes we have left today, we're going to follow a pretty traditional format. So we'll start out by giving an overview of the paper's key questions and arguments. Now, before the talk, Dan told me he was sure that everyone in the room has read this paper, probably read it 3 times by now. I was less confident. So assuming most of you have not read it, we want to give an overview of what we were actually doing and some of the conclusions we came to. After that, Dan will talk a little bit about the extensions of our research, where we can actually take these ideas, right? What we can do beyond studying mixed martial arts, beyond just studying religion, how we can apply them to other sites, whether it's us doing the research or hoping that we inspire other people to take on these questions. This is also where I think we have a bit of a link to this theme of theorizing for the troubled times, right? Our paper is not specifically engaging with that, but some of the extensions I think can potentially engage with it. And I'll let Dan explain how, even though we didn't talk about that before. And then I'll conclude with a bit of a reflection on our approach to theory or theorizing. And hopefully that's of value to you, especially junior scholars, as you're developing your own projects, thinking about how to actually publish an article and make a theory and write a theory-driven paper. And then for those of you who like those kind of grand questions, sitting around and thinking about what we even mean by theory, hopefully that part of our talk interests you. All right, so in terms of empirical questions, it wasn't really a surprising or profound question that led to this paper. I actually think it's a pretty obvious question considering the 2 sites that we were doing research. So our basic question is, why are they doing this? And even more importantly, why do they keep doing this? Right? So what, in other words, keeps people motivated to keep coming back to an action, especially in the face of all these reasons to not do it, right? We were studying these 2 practices where people might drop out because of the pain of the practice, just the time commitment, potentially boredom, potentially uncertainty of why they're there. There's lots of reasons to stop. Why do people actually keep doing that? Now, we were also particularly interested because both of us noticed at the outset of our projects that there were some interesting mismatches between the socio-demographic characteristics of the participants and what we expected to see in those communities, right? So when I got into the mixed martial arts gym, I didn't necessarily see the people I expected, and there was a bigger variety of people than I initially expected. Now, the other thing that's really key, and we'll return to this a few times, is these were not only questions that we were bringing into the sites, right? They already existed in the sites. There was a lot of stuff going on that you see in the top right of the screen. People standing around and talking, right? So it wasn't just that they were training together. Afterwards, they would have these conversations. And in that talk, there were a lot of not only questions, but there were answers being provided about why people might do this thing, why they were doing this thing. And according to our participants, and this is both in the religious sites and both in the mixed martial arts sites, the commitments were about self-development and discovery. They were about finding out who people really were, who they are, and who they could be, and then finding that community that they were always meant to be. So the question we ask is, what do we make of these motive accounts? And I'll let Dan take it over from there.
Yeah, so those empirical questions that Kyle just laid out led us to this more general theoretical question, which is the question of what do we make of the relationship between motive accounts, actors' own explanations for what motivated them to do something, and motivation proper, right? The actual subjective desires or intentionalities that move people to pursue particular ends. And being the good budding junior theorists that we were, we delved into the literature, and we found that, much more prominent and senior theorists than yours truly had given a number of different reasons why we should probably be a bit skeptical that actors' accounts accurately reflect their underlying motivations. So, one reason is just methodologically, we know there are plenty of instances where what people do in one context does not necessarily align with what they say they do or why they do it in another. That's the sort of attitudinal fallacy that has been written about extensively, but probably most recently in a paper by Gerald Mack and Kahn, the Talk is Cheap article that started a lot of really interesting conversations and debates. There's also the issue that we're often just unaware of our own motivations because, like many other animals, right, human beings are creatures of habit, creatures of routine. We also can be motivated by deeply subconscious dispositions, right? What Bourdieu would call a habitus, or more recently, what social psychologists like Jonathan Haidt or cultural sociologists like Steve Vasey have called our type 1 cognitive systems. And finally, another reason, and perhaps one of the most interesting and longstanding, starting all the way back with our motorcycle riding senior theorist there in the middle, C. Wright Mills, but also elaborated by more contemporary sociologists like Ann Swidler, for example, is that motive accounts aren't really about motivation at all. They're really justifications. So instead, so they don't tell us necessarily what subjectively drives actors to do something, but instead give us data on the socially acceptable ways to justify what you've already done. So instead of reflecting subjective springs that precede action, motive accounts are so many rhetorical strings that tie actions already undertaken to the normative context of their occurrence. And these are important insights, and they're not necessarily wrong in all instances. In fact, Kyle and I found some good evidence in both of our sites that actors later fully developed accounts of why they were there didn't appear to match what led them initially through the door in the first instance, right? Most people didn't necessarily have super clear or strong motivations for their first trip through the doors of the gym or the church. People were just curious, checking it out. They weren't sure if this was for them or not. But we did find motive accounts, nevertheless, played pivotal roles for explaining what sustained actors' motivation for that line of activity over time. So once they went through the door, motive accounts started doing what we saw as motivational work. More specifically, at several important stages of actors' religious and MMA careers, we observed motive accounts serving as invitations to talk oneself into the action. That is, the account suggested an interpretive connection between the practices in which actors were currently engaged and elements of their more temporally extended self-narratives, those stories of who they were, are, and might become. So we observe, for example, how other actors in the site, old timers of the scene, if you will, initially offered newcomers motive accounts that suggested that their present interest in Eastern Orthodoxy or MMA was actually motivated by something in their past lives. So maybe a longstanding desire for Eastern mysticism in my case, or a lifelong avoidance of conflict and pain that was problematic in Kyle's site. So what was interesting to us wasn't so much the question of whether these accounts were accurate, right? Are there accurate representations of these hidden motives that are already there, but how they started to spark curiosity of the actors themselves and kept them coming back to learn and experience more. And then how actors themselves started sort of internalizing and taking these accounts into their own biographies. So how we watch people go from, I'm not sure if I belong here, to maybe there's more to this than I thought, to this is what I've been searching for all along. And so observing and analyzing this process led us to theorize motive accounts in a new way, not as reflections of internal springs of motivation, nor as solely rhetorical strings that justified actions motivated by something else entirely, who knows what, right? But instead as what we call hermeneutic hooks that interpretively conjoined a practice with self-identity. So what people were doing with the story of who they were. And our approach builds off hermeneutic theories of subjectivity, especially narrative theories of identity, and pragmatist theories of action, demonstrating how accounts can actually migrate from justificatory to motivational status over time as actors encounter new problems and continue to narrate their own involvement in the practices. So, like Kyle said, I'm sure everyone's read the paper several times already. I didn't actually say that, but it sounds good. That's obviously a brief synopsis of the argument. You can go back and read the paper yet again to get the full version and all of the empirical material we draw on to support it. But in the time I have left, I want to kind of move on to think about what can be done with this perspective beyond the church pews and the gym mats, right? And one of the things that we find in the paper is not only sort of how accounts work with regard to motivation for action, but also when they tend to do this work, when they're the most significant. And we find that they're most significant in these moments of existential uncertainty or ambiguity, when people are asking themselves questions about their own motivation. Why is it that I'm here? Why am I doing this again, right? Now, I think when we reflect on, social careers and commitments that we are ourselves involved in, we can probably notice that there are these patterned moments in these trajectories where we do in fact reflect on why is it we're doing this again. Everyone in this room, right, has an academic career. Many of you are in graduate school or maybe just out of graduate school, and you can even reflect on that process and probably think about moments during that time where you were wondering, why is it that I am doing this again, right? That first semester of graduate school where everything's new, the midpoint of your career where you're trying to sort of develop your academic habitus, right? Like, how do I frame this article? How do I get it into ASR? If you figured that one out, then tell me too. And then later on, right, maybe your ABD, you've got a half-finished dissertation and you're just burned out and you're wondering, like, what, can I do this? Why am I doing this again? So while habituated dispositions, routines, and normative expectations certainly do a lot of work to move our action, our commitments forward within our careers, there's also important instances where habits and expectations become problematized, right? And where people reflect on and question their own motivations for continuing on. right? With that same project, that same relationship, that same half-finished book manuscript, right? And as Kyle said, given the theme of the conference, right, this is likely to be especially acute during unsettled times like the one that we're currently living through, right? Where, we've seen lots of stories in the media, for example, about people reevaluating their commitments in light of large macro level changes. And so how do actors collectively manage these types of motivational crises and keep commitments on track? And we're really interested in what role accounts might play in that process, where people sort of throw out, a hook to remind themselves of why this project or this career trajectory is for and about them. And of course, we can also ask the converse question. We can think about the sociology of quitting, talking yourself out of it, right? So future work we think could explore how accounts contribute to motivating an exit from a particular career and commitment. So it stands to reason we think that accounts may also play an important role in persuading actors to opt out or choose alternative commitments. So once embedded within a particular path, do actors hear competing accounts, perhaps from family members, friends, or peers outside of the community of practice, which suggests that perhaps another commitment would in reality be more fulfilling, more in line with who they are, or wish to become? So is the current commitment just a phase or a stepping stone to something greater that just can't be seen yet? And how and when might such competing accounts motivate actors to leave one line of action and embark on another? I think these answers to these types of questions could stand to make significant contributions, not only to understandings of motive talk, but also the phenomenon of quitting or opting out.
All right, as a way of offering a conclusion or wrapping up the talk, I wanted to briefly reflect on just what type of theorizing did we actually engage in? What type of theorizing was this? And so first observation is it's a very empirically grounded project. We started from a question that was not only about the field, but was intrinsic to the field. And this is one of those places where you can see the value of collaboration, right? We were able to take advantage of this multi-site ethnography, Dan immersed in his site and understanding what's going on in the field, and me immersed in a different site. The other point about our theorizing is it's an example of abductive research or abductive theorizing. We were always tacking back and forth between our empirical data and observations and existing theoretical arguments. And then the final point on this, and then I'll offer a few other reflections the next slide, but the final point on the type of theorizing is, and I think this might be the most interesting or important to me, is that we always tried to balance this hermeneutics of suspicion and trust. We didn't necessarily take what actors say at face value, right? It was not this naive belief that everything they said was automatically true, but we're also not dismissing them entirely. We weren't interested in being those theorists who seek to unmask the hidden motivations of the actors, which I often think of that like Scooby-Doo style of theorizing, where you pull off the shark head and you're like, oh, it was Mr. Johnson the whole time, right? We didn't want to find this hidden motivation, but instead we focus on how the religious converts and mixed martial arts practitioners themselves work through those questions of motivations and how their methods and answers would speak back to ours. In this sense, the theorizing was always a conversation, or I mean, it could be a debate if you're a little bit more antagonistic, but it was always a conversation between what we know and what they know. And that was really key to the project that we engaged in. The other thing I would say is that Dan and I both found it useful to pay attention to the gaps or edges. We could have and did approach this from many different theoretical traditions: symbolic interaction, ethnomethodology, a Foucauldian or Bourdieuian approach, dual process theory. I was seduced by affect theory for a while and still interested in writing an article on this topic from that perspective, and so on. And often we would follow one. And as you know, in grad school, you take a seminar, you take a new class and you get excited and you write a seminar paper from that perspective. So we would follow one of those paths, but the road would often end in the same place. It would get to this area where the theory we were using was not quite giving us enough to explain what we were seeing. It was enough to get us excited about it, but not fully explain it. And so we found value in trying to find that space, right, and exist in there. We found it to be a productive place to explore. Now, there is a danger in being in that place where the approaches meet but don't quite touch, because you do have to write a paper, right? So you have to choose one of those approaches to lead with. And that is signaling to the reviewer, that's the conversation you want to have, right? So a reviewer might say, well, why didn't you start with a different theory? Or why didn't you include this approach, right? So there was always that challenge. We found it to be a productive place, but it is worth acknowledging some of the challenges of being there. And in a sense, here we resonate with what Omar Lizardo labeled as the omnivorous theorist. Being specialists in identifying, intervening in general problematics that exist across often siloed subfields. In other words, we weren't pursuing that type of theory where it's introducing the new old French theorist and we're claiming expertise in it, and that's our contribution, right? We're finding this question that can communicate across all these different areas. And as Dan stated before, we're not actually claiming that any of the previous theorists are wrong, right? Maybe they missed something and we want to shift the attention a bit, but we think that what they were saying actually has a lot of value. And instead, our hope, which is kind of a humble goal, even though I use a rather dramatic picture to symbolize it, but we had the humble goal of just offering a tentative bridge between a number of those differing approaches, right? Different theoretical approaches, different subdisciplines in the field, for instance, even between the two of us, sport and religion, and then as some of the categorical divisions that have long existed within cultural sociology. So you could think about the motivation justification split, automatic versus discursive cognition, action versus talk, right? We wanted to find that space and try to find a way to bring those areas together, or at least offer a bridge or a way to communicate. So I think I'll end the talk there, and thank you again. It was fun to think through these ideas, and we're excited to answer any questions you have now, or feel free to email us if you have thoughts or observations as well. And I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Great, thank you so much. And so maybe in a little bit of an experimental Zoom webinar formula, we're going to promote all the attendees to panelists to have a brief discussion about this before our next panel. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. If anyone doesn't want to be on camera, just make sure to mute your camera and turn yourself off, and you know, no worries. But if you have a question, raise your hand and we'll prioritize you. Great. So sorry, it is a one at a time kind of process. So I'm going as fast as I can. But great, yeah, there was a question, I believe. So feel free to unmute yourself.
Hey. So I have a question, not a question, but I kind of want to know more. So hi, Dan and Kylan, I love the paper, obviously. So I wanted you to talk more about this thing you said about hermeneutics of, trust and suspicion, like of revealing and of suspicion. I think this is really great, and I just want to hear more. I think one way that I've been playing with to push this is like there's all this discussion between first person perspective and third person perspective, right? John Martin has kind of is the last to kind of go through that door. But I wonder, like, this interplay, it's neither, right? It's not like a first person kind of and a third person. And I kind of wonder if a way to think about it is to think about like a second person perspective, right? Like when your friends do something that's, you might tell them like, oh, you're tired and cranky. And they're like, no, I'm not tired. And you're like, oh, yes, you are. Right. But you have to say why. You can't say that. You can't kind of commit it as a kind of third person. It's kind of comes out of a kind of interaction between you. Anyway, so I thought that's really great and can be further developed.
Yeah, I think that's kind of an I thou, right? Second person perspective, and it does mirror onto that, right? Like even in that scenario with friends, right? It kind of mirrors that suspicion and trust, right? You have that trust with the person you're talking to, but you're not quite buying that they're really not cranky, right? And you're trying to sort of persuade or convince them that your particular take on their behavior and their attitude is correct. And I think, I think that's really, I mean, I've reflected on my own time in the field as well, and just all of the times, and I know you've experienced this as well, and probably many of the panelists involved in ethnography, at how many times, the actors that I was studying had all sorts of accounts for me about why I was really there, and it was usually to convert, right? They were like, well, we'll see, but you're really here to become Eastern Orthodox, right? And so I think that is also reflective of that same kind of process of moving back and forth, tacking back and forth between suspicion and trust, and that it's a very interactive process. And it's something that I think Kyle and I sort of learned from and probably picked up through those interactions in the field ourselves.
I think you answered that really well. I don't have too much to add to it. Yeah, I'll leave it there so we can have more space for questions. I do think it's an important methodological observation, but I guess I won't have an answer to it. My question is, it's hard to see how that plays out in the writing itself, right? So we could think about how we employ that in our theorizing, but how you include that in the constraints of writing an article. That's something that I continue to dwell on. But yeah, we'll see. Leave space for more questions.
Just to avoid awkward silences, I have another question for you. So people say lots of things, right? I mean, think about like being a grad student, and like one day you're like, oh my God, this is wonderful. I get a thing, and people pay me money. And then like the next day you're like, they're not paying me enough. And that's not thinking, and that's horrible. And I mean, so you say these very different things over the course, right? Often over a pretty short time period, or but definitely across your career. And then things happen. So there's a sense in which your paper goes mostly forward, right? There's like forms of speech, and then they allow or disallow actions of specific kinds, right? But what about the opposite direction, right? Where something happens and then you kind of pick things like, I don't know. So again, think about, let's take like an optimistic grad student story, right? I mean, somebody's been mostly complaining through the grad career, and then they get like this amazing job on their first time. And then they're like, I always said that this is going to go well, right? I mean, and it's not that they never said that, but you selectively remember, right? There's all these pasts that you can choose from. And a lot of what we're doing, like when we're constructing these narratives, is choosing pasts. So how do you think about this movement back, right, in time in some ways? And then also, does it complicate methodologically what you're finding? Because people say like, oh yeah, you see, it was like what I said before. And so it looks like it moves forward in that way. But that's one of many things that they've said before, right? So I'm not doubting that you're right, actually, but there's this other temporal movement that I'm wondering about.
So yeah, I mean, I think that's, so people are, I would say that, people are moving, we're sort of following people's action right forward in time, right? The sort of, if you will, maybe it's a third person perspective on their career in that moment, right? We're watching them come through, we're following people coming through the door, being in the site for a little while, right? Being sort of a more veteran member of the scene. So we're following that trajectory. But yeah, I mean, and this is part of the process, people do go back, right? And remember their past in creative ways. And again, to us, it's not, that's kind of the sort of like interesting and magical part about accounts, is that people can go back and remember something and not even be, I mean, I think this happens a lot. It's not necessarily being dishonest, but people will, at least in my site, people would often say, would tell me a story about how they felt walking through the doors of the church. And I had been there when they did, and that didn't seem to be accurate to me. But on the account of its telling, it was very important for whatever was happening in that present moment, right? So I think that's in terms of the actual biography itself, it's not always forward in time. It can jump from past to present to future within that moment of the career trajectory. And I think that's one of the more fascinating things that happens with accounting for oneself.
Great.
Yeah, and I think they almost had to be engaging in that type of refreshing of the narrative, and sometimes when there wasn't some sort of shift, it would be telling those old stories time after time. But there was constantly little iterations going on as the new people that entered the site, as new stories were brought in. So I think it was actually more the exception that wasn't happening, right?
Wonderful. Thank you. So we have questions from Simone and then from Amanda. Simone?
Okay. First off, I apologize. I know the incoming chair and Simone is the one leaving, but we're not the same person. There was a confusion. I'm using Simone's link. He alerted me to the JTS going on right now, so I just click on it. So I apologize. I'm Claudio and Secret. So I had like a sort of two follow-up questions. One building on what Ido said about first, third, second person. How much of a difference it makes that you have all these practices that actually instill in people third-personness, right? And so both, Buddhism and psychoanalysis think of objectifying who you are in a way in which, your ego, it's not like the end of who you are, right? And again, these are two very different practices, but like you can put them together almost as, like third person evaluation of yourself practices, right? Like the idea is always like, who's there is not you, right? It's something other that this is like an emanation, right? And so like I was wondering, like given that this exercise and exercise in general theorizing of some way, like how much would this, like be appropriate for practices in which there's not like a third personness, if you wish, like they are instilled. And the second one, and this is like, like, again, it's probably like been going on forever, but I feel like you end up going back to the settle and settle sort of like, like Anne Swidler distinction. And I always have like the issue of, like, again, what's the definition of the situation there, right? Like what makes it settle and settle? It's always kind of like unclear, or like a meta definition by the researcher maybe, that is not like, central to someone's life, right? And so, I don't know, like, I think that I wanted to hear more on, if you wish, why we end up going back to that distinction that seems so problematic to begin with, if you wish. So it's like two very different questions, actually.
Kyle, you or me to start? I don't.
You can start. I'm still thinking about that second question, part of the question.
Yeah. So the instill in persons, the sort of, these are practices that instill in people a sort of, the practices that encourage people to objectify themselves, right? To take sort of an outside perspective on their actions. I mean, I think that's, what's interesting to me is that, and has been interesting for Kyle and I both, is that we actually, in this case comparison, we thought was actually, what made it interesting is that religion is the case primarily, and probably along with psychoanalysis too. It's sort of seen as religion is about belief. Religion is about, right, taking on that sort of like, super ego, right, and that third person perspective of yourself. And of course, like part of my work has been to sort of like problematize that religion is all in the head perspective. But of course it does happen, and it happens at particular moments that people sort of objectify and problematize their own behavior, or it gets problematized for them. In Kyle's case, right, sport is usually the arena, right? This is Bourdieu's favorite metaphor, right? For the not thinking, right? For the not instilling the third person perspective on yourself. It's about action. It's about doing. It's about, not stopping and thinking about what you're doing, because you'll mess up whatever skill it is that you're trying to perform. But what's so interesting about Kyle's case is that, a lot of the time was spent, after you were done practicing those skills, you were off the mat talking about what you just did and about your life and what was going on, right, with you. And in fact, I think there's a number of interesting studies about sport that do talk about, all of the work, right, the practice that goes into and reflection on one's own exercise and skill and practice. So I think it's an empirical question, in fact, like how little or great amounts of third personness are instilled within a site. I actually think it happens a lot in a lot of sites. And some of this is just sort of like stereotypes that we bring into practices that we don't know a lot about. But it's an open question. It is something that I think we should explore more and not just assume at the outset.
Well, just to add on that, I think just before we get to the second one, I think that would be fascinating to specifically choose those sites, because I've been brainstorming like what would be the sites where we would not expect that third personness to occur. Like those would be interesting places to research to figure out how much talking yourself into it is actually going on. And it might be a part, think about my site. Participants are joining the site and they're doing something new with they're engaging in a new practice that was foreign to them before that. And so that might be we could say, well, that's part of why that talk is occurring, but it's not necessarily a site that has this imposed story about, this is why you're doing it. So I don't know, it'd be interesting to think about what are the activities that people commit themselves to that lack that. Completely would be a strong word, but that would lack that. Right? Were there things specifically that you were thinking of?
No, not really. I think it's interesting because you see these are two long-lasting practices. They're almost their objective is to like make you think of that displacement between first and third person. And of course, like Dan is saying, religion has that, but honestly, like, following up on what Dan is saying too, there's a lot of studies on dance, on sports and whatever that actually have that reflexive moment, the looking at yourself in the mirror, the sort of understanding what you're doing. And so it's interesting to see those two realms, but I don't know, like I'm kind of fascinated because I do feel like sometimes in everyday life, when you talk to people, they don't seem to have a third person account of themselves. Right. Yeah. So there's a part of, I'm not going to say academics don't have it, but I happen to have, most of my friends seem to be academic, and a lot of them don't seem to have that sort of third person reflexive idea of themselves. And so I'm just curious. So, like, again, and I think it's true. It might be like an empirical by empirical case, and it might be kind of fascinating to find the paradox of the place where you think you're never going to find it, like the ice cream parlor, and you do find it regardless. So I don't know. It was just like an open question. It wasn't.
No, I really like that. Yeah, I like that question a lot.
Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted you, Dan. You were about to start answering the second part, and I cut you off.
The second part. I won't spend a lot of time on it. I don't necessarily want to go back to making that. I wasn't trying to make some sort of like, and now we're back to, settled versus unsettled times as like sort of the linchpin of the argument we're making. Maybe I casted it off a little too, maybe we added that in a little too casually. But it was really just, making a point that, this process of talking yourself into it, sort of accounting for our own motivations for action is actually I mean, not something that we do all the time. It usually happens in a moment of, we actually draw more on the pragmatists on this, sort of those moments within action itself, right? Where there's a problem, and we actually think that this happens in sort of socially patterned moments throughout these career trajectories. But the point about unsettled times was just like we think it becomes especially interesting when you have what was one of the other panelists talk about, like this sort of macro event, right? That unsettling, right? That sort of problematic things happen in the course of, any sort of career trajectory or any form of commitment at some points. But if we're in sort of a context where we're having sort of a global economic crisis or a global pandemic, there's a lot of problematizing happening across different career trajectories and commitments. So I just kind of wanted to signal that using Swidler's words, I guess, in that slide. So
we're running way over, but I'm hoping that we can quickly fit in Amanda and Oded before we take a very short break before our next panel.
Hi, thanks so much for a great talk. And I love your paper. It's been so generative for me as I worked on some of my own projects. A very brief question, actually. I've been thinking a lot about institutional narratives, and I'm curious how your interlocutors interacted with, perhaps contradicted or viewed themselves as in agreement with existing institutional narratives. There must be institutional narratives in both of your cases, those imposed stories that Kyle mentioned, that people see themselves in relationship with. And so how does that play into the way that people make sense of their actions and their motivations? How do they frame their own relationship with the institution through their narratives?
So Dan, you probably have, I'll say a few quick things. You probably have a better case for answering that, because part of the things that fascinated me about mixed martial arts was the ambiguity, was the way that all these people were bringing so many different narratives into the site. So there were not as many top-down narratives. But there were cases that I observed where in some cases people chose not to be in a gym because the gym itself, it wasn't like this giant, every MMA gym had the same story, but people would enter an MMA gym and they would have there'd be particular narratives about why people are training, and a participant would go in and say, this place isn't for me. I can't make myself fit, right? There's too much of a conflict. This place is too masculine. It's too focused on particular understandings of, biology for why we're doing this activity. It just doesn't work for me. And then they gravitate towards a place with different stories. There were also people in the gym whose identity was in part to push back against the institutional narrative, and that became part of how they talked themselves into it. Like, this is who I am. I'm in this space, but look how I'm a little bit askew from it. But my site was so kind of open for those things that I don't know. With Dan's, it would be a bigger deal if you're pushing back against the institutional story. So I'm also curious what Dan would say. I don't think we've had this conversation.
Well, so conversion, like the way that people talk about their conversions are usually like highly scripted events. But what's interesting in the Eastern Orthodox case is that in some ways, like how Eastern Orthodox Christianity, I'm not assuming a lot of familiarity with it in the audience, but if you don't know much about it, it was not a hotbed for religious conversions for most of its history in the United States. I mean, it was the home of, these different ethnic immigrant groups and their descendants. So you had Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, right, Syrian Orthodox. So the conversion, the converts thing is new. And so this is one of those half-written papers that I probably need to finish one day. But what's interesting is how this new kind of script, right, this new institutional script kind of got built up from, in some ways, scratch from the narratives of converts themselves. They had to sort of like build it up as more and more of them came into Eastern Orthodoxy. And within that, and there is an institutional script, and I have another kind of article about this on how Eastern Orthodox converts tell their story. But within that general form, there's actually like a lot of play and creativity. So people can tell a lot of interesting individual stories and individual variations on the story within that institutional script without necessarily going out of bounds. And one of the things that the Eastern Orthodox, the institution of the church does is actually allow room for that in a lot of ways, in interesting ways, where people, you know, I saw priests tell people, and this is in the article too, like, oh yeah, there are interesting similarities between Eastern Orthodox Christianity and Hinduism. Right, like in some ways, because that was like something that they could make a connection between their church and somebody's background, right? And so they're what's interesting to me in this case too is the interplay between those institutional and personal stories, right? And how they sort of inform each other. But that's a really, really good question.
Yeah, and I'll just add one other thing quickly to it, because I know we're running out of time. But this is it's a really fascinating question in MMA and mixed martial arts culture right now, because during the past year and a half, there's been a dominant shift to the right, and MMA gyms have become a rich site for conspiracy theory, for protests against vaccines. And so one of the projects I'm hoping to work on now is talking to people who stopped training during this time and how they missed the physical practice, but them trying to make sense of how do they actually fit into this site, which was this open place for exchange, for potential kind of a celebration of people having these different narratives. Suddenly with this move, how do people talk themselves into it or fail to do so, right? So that's something I'm hoping to explore, and we'll see what happens. But yeah, great question.
This is a great conversation. Oded, I don't think we're going to have time for your question. I hope you can continue the conversation over email. We've just got a couple minutes until our next panel. And I hope you will all rejoin or stay around for that one. It's on race, markets, and work. Our discussant is Professor Fred Wary, and that's going to go from 3:30 to 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So hope to see you all in a couple minutes.
Thank you again, everyone. Those are really good questions.
Yes, thank you so much. And I think we are going to return to our standard webinar format. So stay tuned for that. But what a treat to have all of us in this same Zoom room. I'm also going to stop the recording. So just